Grief, shock and disbelief in the Scottish town of Dunblane. 16 children and their teacher die when a gunman opens fire on their gym class. And in Egypt, world leaders talk peace. The small town of Dunblane in central Scotland is tonight in deep shock and mourning after the massacre today of 16 children and their teacher in a local primary school. The children, aged between 5 and 6, were shot dead in the school gymnasium by a former scout leader, Thomas Hamilton, who then shot himself. 15 of the children, pictured here with their teacher Gwen Mayer, died at the scene. One died later in hospital. Most of the others were wounded, some seriously. Tonight the injured are being treated in hospitals in nearby Stirling and in Glasgow. In Dunblane tonight is our correspondent Brian O'Connell. Brian.
Well, tonight here in Dunblane, the sense of loss is almost palpable. You can almost feel it. People are trying to come to terms with what happened. They don't know why it happened, and they certainly don't know why it happened here. Tonight they're still dealing with the injured in Stirling Royal Infirmary. Were taken here to Stirling Royal Infirmary. 3 seriously injured children were later transferred to another hospital, but there are still 2 children here in intensive care. 2 others are now in the children's ward having had surgery, and there are 2 injured adults. Many of the wounded children had several gunshot wounds. Tonight, medical staff who were first on the scene have been describing what they encountered.
We arrived as a group, and our job is to assess the injuries, so we decided we all went for individual children and decided who had priority for immediate evacuation and who could wait for the second phase of evacuation.
At Dunblane's primary school, the scene of the horror, tonight people have been leaving flowers at the gate. They wonder why it happened and why it happened here. Dunblane is a close-knit rural community trying to come to terms with a senseless act of violence.
Earlier this evening, Brian O'Connell spoke to one mother who was late bringing her child to the primary school this morning. Diane Fraser arrived while the gunman was still causing carnage.
When I arrived at the school, there was a gunshot and a teacher cried out to us to run, and we ran to a room where the children were having a music lesson. We were going to have a music lesson, and from there somebody came and asked would some of us come to the gymnasium as they needed adult help. And we went along there and found that there were lots of children and teacher injured. We couldn't really see the extent of the injuries at first. And there were about 5 children who were carried out into the corridor alongside the gymnasium. And we just did what we could for the children, was sat with them for about 45 minutes at least before an ambulance arrived.
Were the children badly injured?
They didn't seem to be critically injured, but some of them had gunshot wounds. It appeared as if they'd got gunshot wounds that had gone right through the body, right through their arm, out to the other side. But they had lots of superficial cuts. And as I say, it was a long time before, 45 minutes at least before the first ambulance arrived. And that came from
Why did it take so long?
I don't know. I don't know whether it was a lack of communication or whether there just weren't the services available. I don't know. But the police were there, and we were asking several times where the ambulances were, and they said they were on the way.
So the children must have been in some distress?
They were extremely distressed, and there was only one telephone line, so we couldn't telephone for their parents either, and they just wanted their parents to come and comfort them. But we did the best that we could.
What did you do?
Well, we just put bandages onto their wounds, and we just really comforted them, so kept them warm. And they were suffering from shock, and in total I would say it was an hour and a half before they were actually seen by a doctor. And by that time they were very, very shocked and becoming very stiff and upset.
And at what point did the police arrive?
The police arrived quite soon. One police car arrived quite soon on the scene, and then within about 3/4 of an hour there were lots of police, but still no ambulance.
Did the police then attempt to find out where the ambulances were?
Yes, I think they did.
And have you had any explanation as to why it took 3/4 of an hour for the ambulance to arrive?
No, I haven't. No.
Brian, as you said a moment ago, people in Dunblane tonight must be numb with grief. But what news is there of the survivors, of the casualties being treated tonight?
Sorry, I can't hear you very clearly. Could you repeat the question?
What is the news about the casualties?
Well, news about the casualties are that there are 2 children still in intensive care at Stirling Royal Infirmary. 3 other children were transferred, and there are 2 adults who are very seriously injured as well in Stirling Royal Infirmary at the moment. As you know, 1 teacher was killed, 2 other adults were injured in the gym. I think, though, as well as that, it's the psychological casualty as much as anything else. They brought in teams of counsellors here at the moment. It's a bit similar to after the Hungerford massacre, if you remember, in 1989. And it's the psychological damage that's done not just to the children, not just to the parents, but almost the whole town. It's a very small, close-knit community here that is really going to be the cost.
And what about the gunman, Thomas Hamilton? What details are emerging about the sort of man he was?
He was a loner, we know that. He lived in Stirling. He was a member of a gun club, and he was a former scoutmaster. He had been chucked out of the Scouts because of what they describe as inappropriate behaviour. More than that at the moment we don't know, but he certainly was a strange man who lived alone, very much a loner.
Brian, thank you very much for that. There we'll leave it. The children of primary class 1 were playing in the school gymnasium when the gunman burst in at about 9:15 and opened fire. News of the attack spread quickly through the town as parents rushed to the school, not knowing if their children were alive or dead.
It has been described as the slaughter of the innocents. After news of the bizarre and horrific tragedy spread around Dunblane, parents frantically made their way to the school. For each one of them, the horrible nightmare of waiting to see whose children were dead.
First everything was normal, and then there was 8 gunshots, and then the police came and everything got so noisy, and I got scared.
It was about 20 to 9. We'd just been doing a bit of reading until our teacher got our work sorted out, and then we heard these gunshots in the gym. We looked around and thought, oh, he must just be firing at a target or something. Then he came out through a fire exit and started firing at our huts, and God, we were all petrified.
One school board member attempted to describe her mixed emotions of anguish at the Dunblane massacre and relief that her 3 children were alive.
I don't know how long it was, just waiting, wandering, trying to keep the children unaware that there was anything wrong. And then Mrs. Isles was called out of the classroom to help to go to the gym. And then I just found out that at that stage I knew it was primary 1, and then I found out that it wasn't my daughter's class, and I felt relieved, and then I felt terribly guilty that I felt relieved.
At a police briefing in Dunblane today, Shadow Scottish Secretary and local man George Robertson spoke of this act of unspeakable brutality.
I'm bound to know many of the casualties and the parents concerned, and I know just how traumatic and devastating it will be in this town today.
Queen Elizabeth has sent her heartfelt sympathy to the people of Dunblane, and Prime Minister John Major has described the massacre as this mad and evil act.
They were where they should have been safe. They're perhaps of a generation that has more to look forward to in optimism and hope than any before. And suddenly this appalling act just snuffs out all that opportunity.
I don't think that words can really describe the depth of the tragedy and the horror that people will feel. These were little children who, at the weekend, would have been playing with their brothers and sisters and their mothers and fathers, who went out to school today with the whole of their lives in front of them, and now nothing.
Tonight in Dunblane, the normally tranquil Highlands town is laden with unspeakable grief. This recent photograph is a poignant memory of Gwen Mayer and her Primary 1 class.
School children have been the targets of deranged attacks in the past. Experts, desperate to understand the motivation behind such outrages, say that typically the attackers harbour deep feelings of resentment and bitterness. and have been building up to their crimes for some time.
Before today's horrendous attack in Dunblane, the previous worst single shooting in Britain was in the town of Hungerford in Berkshire in 1987. Michael Ryan, armed with a Kalashnikov semi-automatic rifle, embarked on an hour-long rampage through the town, leaving 16 dead before taking refuge in a local school and killing himself. Ryan, like Thomas Hamilton, was a gun enthusiast and gun club member, and new controls on automatic weapons were introduced in the wake of the Hungerford attack. Crowded and with easy access, schools have proved an all-too-easy target for deranged attacks. In Paris 3 years ago, a lone gunman demanding a ransom held a class of preschool children hostage for days. A police siege and an agonising vigil by parents ended when the children were released unharmed. In Britain in March 1994, a former pupil at the Hallgart School in Cleveland, Stephen Wilkinson, burst into a classroom and fatally stabbed 12-year-old Nikki Conroy and injured 2 of her classmates. A deep-seated grudge was said to be at the heart of an attack by Garrett Stephen Bell on his former school in Hollywood, County Down 2 years ago. Several students were injured after Bell entered a classroom and turned a homemade flamethrower on them.
Here, parents and teachers have expressed their shock at the attack in Scotland, but despite calls in Britain for better security at schools, Parents and Teachers Associations say it would be dangerous to turn schools into fortresses.
As the nightmare unfolded in Dunblane, it emerged that just weeks ago Scottish teaching unions had called for a review of security in schools. What they had in mind, however, were measures to cope with less serious incidents of violence, threats against teachers and intruders entering school grounds. Already the stabbing to death of Irish-born schoolteacher Philip Lawrence in London last year has resulted in police being given powers to search pupils for weapons. And just last week, a school in Leicester in Britain became the first ever to hire a security guard. Here, like anywhere else, schools are quite open, with easy access. The policy of the Irish National Teachers Organisation is that every school should have a caretaker or somebody to meet people who come onto school property. In many cases, people can just walk right in, unchallenged. But today the INTO said while security is important, schools must not be turned into prisons.
We don't want people now to start making fortresses out of schools. This kind of extraordinary happening could happen in any place where people gather. We have gone to a lot of trouble over a lot of years to make schools open and welcoming.
And the National Parents Council also warned against any knee-jerk reaction to today's events.
We have to bear in mind what we want our schools to do. We want them to reflect the kind of society we want to live in and we want our children to live in. If we turn them into something that's more like a prison than a school, we'll absolutely undermine the self-confidence of children and their teachers within those schools.
Now, still to come in tonight's 9 o'clock news, the Peacemakers Conference in Egypt. Also 10 days of intensive talks on the North End without agreement. And a great day for the Irish at Cheltenham. Join us in a few minutes.
A luxurious
Hello again. The main news tonight, of course, the shooting dead of 16 young school children in Dunblane in Scotland this morning. The rest of tonight's news now. The World Anti-Terrorism Summit in Egypt has ended with a declaration by President Clinton that peace will prevail. The conference agreed to set up a working group on the peace process in the Middle East. It's to report back within 30 days. The Taoiseach, who attended the summit, discussed the peace process here with President Clinton and John Major. Peter Klusky reports now from the conference centre at Sharm el-Sheikh.
Emerging briefly for a photo call mid-afternoon, it was already clear that this summit had achieved its primary aim. It's been the most remarkable turnout of world leaders ever in support of one goal, peace. Banking on this one-day conference to put the Middle East peace process back on track, the 30 leaders at the summit, co-chaired by US President Clinton and Egyptian President Mubarak, have spoken with one voice in their condemnation of terrorism.
We have gathered before to celebrate new milestones in our journey. Today we join in common defense against those who would turn us back. We are here because we know what is at stake.
But the Israeli Prime Minister, Shimon Peres, with most to gain and most to lose from this summit, was most hard-hitting.
This terrorism is not anonymous. It has a name,
it has an address, it has a bank account, it has an infrastructure, it has a network, camouflaged charity organizations. It is spearheaded by a country, Iran.
The Palestinian President Yasser Arafat called for a permanent international committee to coordinate the peace process, but his spokesman admitted that serious hurdles remain.
We have problems. We have serious problems. The closure and the siege of Gaza is really giving us a heavy blow, dealing a heavy blow to our economy and therefore to our people.
With Ireland's own peace process in continuing difficulty, the Taoiseach Mr Bruton sounded this warning.
Punishment must only go to those who have been responsible for evil acts. Entire communities should not and do not deserve to be punished for acts of minorities.
And later, after a meeting in the fringes with John Major and Bill Clinton, he called on the IRA to restore its ceasefire, saying that would open the door to all-party talks for Sinn Féin.
This is, I think, very important for them to do this now. They have the talks that they were looking for. They're available for them. The place at the table is waiting for them. All that needs to be done is for the IRA to simply reinstate its ceasefire so that the peace process can proceed.
As the delegations prepared to leave this evening, the summit spelt out its conclusions. A drive to cut off finance and support for terrorism, a working group to report back in 30 days, and an interim meeting in a fortnight.
Now throughout the region, as well as the world, there are peacemakers who stand together against terror, for security, and for the cause of peace.
The challenge now is to translate the outcome from today's summit into concrete actions, the type of actions which can end the violence and restore the Middle East peace process.
Mr. Clinton arrived in Israel this evening with Prime Minister Perez, who travelled with him on Air Force One. The American president was intent on fulfilling his promise to stand side by side with the Israeli people in their grief at the bombing deaths that prompted the Sharm el-Sheikh conference. Mr. Perez paid tribute to his efforts in support of the peace process.
Whatever could have been done internationally, regionally, nationally and humanly, the President took the initiative to do so, and did, with great devotion.
Later, Mr. Clinton was entertained to dinner by Israel's President, Ezer Weizmann. Tomorrow he'll attend a meeting of the Israeli cabinet and a memorial service for Yitzhak Rabin, assassinated in November by Israeli right-winger Yigal Amir.
On the peace process here, the British government is tonight expected to press ahead with plans for elections in Northern Ireland. 10 days of intensive consultations between the northern parties, excluding Sinn Féin, ended today without agreement on what form the elections should take.
10 days ago, Sinn Féin's protest at the party's exclusion overshadowed the opening of these intensive consultations. Since then, they've been proceeding less dramatically, but in some form or another, all the North's parties except Sinn Féin have been involved at a variety of locations. Today's final session at Stormont saw those close to Loyalist paramilitary thinking in discussions with Sir Patrick Mayhew. Earlier, the other Loyalist fringe group maintained that last night's statement from the CLMC threatening retaliation to any new IRA bomb attacks didn't signal an end to their ceasefire.
Effectively, they seem to have gone out of their way not to say that 1 or 2 or 3 bombs or even resumption in Northern Ireland will specifically encourage them back to violence. I think what they're saying is there is an inevitability here. Whilst we desire peace, there is an inevitability that we can be drawn into this conflict. Don't let that happen. I think that that's essentially the statement that, as I read it.
Sir Patrick Mayhew said that the Loyalist threat was a serious one, but he said he took hope from the commitment to democracy in the paramilitary statement, and he said the talks process had made a big contribution.
We are greatly encouraged for the future by the way in which these very difficult problems have been seriously engaged, seriously addressed. I think that bodes very well for the future of the negotiations which it is the purpose of all of us to bring about immediately after the election process and starting on the 10th of June, as the two governments have committed themselves to.
The Northern Secretary said his government would now move to decide on the form of elections that would precede the talks due to start on June the 10th. He's due to review the process tomorrow in Dublin with Dick Spring, who saw the SDLP in his final round of meetings this afternoon.
The political process is going to proceed irrespective of the type of violence that other people are using.
We are determined to pursue and to press ahead with the constitutional parties. And I have to say, in direct reply to your question, Charlie, that I do not believe that the voters of the Republic of Ireland would want us dealing with Sinn Féin while there's violence and bombs going off in the background.
Sinn Féin's Mitchell McLaughlin said this evening that the talks were another British failure and that by excluding his party, both governments had shown they weren't interested in accommodating their electorate. But unless the IRA ceasefire is resumed, Sinn Féin will remain on the fringes. Next week, the British government unveils its election plans. Dublin will be insisting that they move directly into negotiations on June the 10th. The process is moving on, and for the moment, without Republican involvement.
The row over who pays the massive European Union fine for irregularities in the beef industry here is continuing tonight, with the trade union SIPTU saying there's widespread dismay among PAYE workers at the idea of their footing most of the bill. Earlier, about 2,000 farmers took to the streets in protest at the drop in cattle prices. They strongly criticised plans to make beef processors pay additional charges resulting from the EU fine. Workers at the Mitsumi electronics factory in Mallow in County Cork are meeting tonight after the company told them that half the workforce is to be made redundant. Price-cutting competition from the Far East is being blamed for the situation. And workers at Cork City's biggest employer, Apple Computers, have been told their factory is to close for 2 extra days over the holiday weekend. The Minister for Enterprise and Employment, Richard Bruton, is to meet Apple management to discuss the situation. Sports news, and there were no real surprises in Mick McCarthy's first squad as Irish soccer manager for the upcoming match against Russia. However, the new manager did suggest a change in tactics for Ireland and hinted at the introduction of a new defensive system.
Bringing the focus back to football, Mick McCarthy announced senior and under-21 squads for the forthcoming games against Russia at a news conference in Dublin this afternoon. He also took the opportunity of introducing his assistant Ian Evans, a friend and colleague for over 15 years. After all the recent troubles at Merrion Square, the game of football was finally back on the agenda.
I suppose my difficulties start now, don't they? People keep asking me how it's going. I said, well, I have no idea because we haven't had a game. But we'll play a different way. We'll play a different system. What I will gain out of it is to see whether some players are up to it, some players are still up to it. See whether players can adapt to the way I want to play. A lot of things, I suppose, after the game will tell me more than now.
We don't know too much about Ian Evans. Obviously you do, you've worked with him for a while. Why choose him as your assistant?
Why? Because he's the best guy there is. I've known him for 16 years, I played with him. I've been coached by him. I've worked with him as manager and coach. He's a first-class character.
I had 12 months managing Swansea, late 80s, early 90s, for just 12 months, and that was enough. Never again. I then realised that my place was on the training pitches and coaching and teaching players, and that's what I enjoy, and that's what I think I'm good at.
At Cheltenham, it was a good day for the Irish today. Clarence Davis was Ireland's big winner on the second day of the festival, winning the Queen Mother Champion Chase. But there were 3 other wins as well.
March 13th was lucky for the Irish. Day 2 at Cheltenham began and ended with Irish wins. Aidan O'Brien had his first Cheltenham winner with Urubande in the first race of the day, in the safe hands of champion jockey Charlie Swan.
100 yards to go and Urubande has it. Karsh is trying to come out here with the black colours and finishing best of all is going forward, but Urubande is going to take it. Urubande going forward, Karsh in the 1, 2, 3.
But it was in the big race of the day that the Irish really made their mark. We had 3 potential winners, but in the end only 1 horse romped home, the Arthur Moore-trained Clarence Davis.
Clarence Davis going on. Viking Flagship's coming back at him in second place, but Clarence Davis has the acceleration to win. Clarence Davis, Viking Flagship, Sound ran the 1, 2, 3.
Loving Around made it an Irish hat-trick, but thrill of the day for the punters was the victory of Whither or Which. So a night of celebrations in the Cotswolds for the winning Irish quartet, and all eyes on tomorrow's Gold Cup.
But the main news tonight, I'm afraid, is that the people of the Scottish town of Dunblane are tonight in shock and mourning after this morning's massacre at their local primary school. 16 children and their teacher were killed. The gunman then killed himself. That's all from us. Until tomorrow at 9, a very good night to you.